The English city of Leicester was the first city in the medieval England that underwent the complete expulsion of Jews in 1231. Although it may seem local at first, this is actually the place that begun a series of events that led to the ultimate expulsion of Jews from all the Britain in 1290. But how did they end up in the Leicester in the first place? Where did they come from? Leicester finds its foundation in the Iron Age settlement of the Coryaltauvi, a Celtic tribe that established a significant presence along the eastern banks of the river Soar, long before the arrival of Mediterranean legions. By the middle of the 1st century, approximately 47 CE, the Roman military identified this strategic river crossing as a vital link for the Fosse Way, the grand diagonal frontier road designed to connect the southwestern coast of Britain with the northern Humber estuary. Under the name Ratae Coryaltavorum, the settlement transitioned into a formal Roman civitas capital, adopting the grid-based urban planning that characterized the empire's administrative reach. Archaeological excavations have unearthed the remains of a sprawling forum and basilica complex alongside the Jury Wall, a massive piece of masonry that stands as one of the largest surviving civilian Roman structures in Britain. This wall originally formed part of the public palaestra, the exercise hall adjacent to the city's elaborate bathhouse system, signifying a high level of Romanization in the province of Britannia. As the Western Roman Empire's administrative grip loosened in the early 5th century, the urban infrastructure of Ratae did not vanish, but underwent a slow transformation into the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Leicester. During the 8th century, the town served as the seat of the bishops of Leicester, establishing a spiritual authority that complemented its geographical importance. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 877 CE fundamentally altered the region's demographic and political landscape, as Leicester was incorporated as one of the 5 boroughs of the Danelaw. This period introduced Old Norse linguistic elements and Scandinavian legal customs that merged with the existing Mercian traditions, creating a culturally syncretic society. The subsequent reconquest by the Kingdom of Wessex and the later Norman conquest of 1066 further solidified the town's role as a primary center of trade and military governance in the English Midlands. The Norman administration, under the leadership of Hugh de Grandmesnil, the first Norman sheriff of Leicester, oversaw the construction of a motte and bailey castle and the revitalization of the town's ancient Roman walls. It was within this post-conquest environment of economic restructuring and political consolidation that the first Jewish settlers arrived in England, having traveled from Rouen in Normandy following the invitation of William the Conqueror. These early pioneers were not farmers or soldiers, but specialists in the nascent credit economy, providing the liquid capital required for the king's ambitious castle-building projects and the expansion of Norman ecclesiastical infrastructure. By the early 12th century, small but significant Jewish communities began to move inward from the primary port of London into provincial centers like Leicester, establishing themselves as vital agents of the crown's fiscal system. Their legal status was unique, existing outside the traditional feudal hierarchy as direct subjects of the monarch, which afforded them royal protection while making them the primary source of secular taxation in the medieval economy. In Leicester, these settlers occupied dwellings near the High Cross, the commercial heart of the borough, where the vestiges of Roman masonry still defined the boundaries of the medieval town. The legal framework governing the Jewish community in post-conquest England was defined by the doctrine of Judaei sunt proprium fiscus regis, establishing that the Jewish people and all their possessions were technically the private property of the crown. This singular status removed them from the jurisdiction of common law and the local manorial courts that governed the Christian peasantry and burgeoning burgess class. Instead, they were subject to the direct will of the monarch, a relationship codified in various charters and royal writs that evolved throughout the 11th and 12th centuries. This relationship provided a necessary albeit fragile shield against local ecclesiastical and municipal hostilities, as any harm inflicted upon a Jewish subject was legally interpreted as an affront to the king's own person and treasury. The crown's protection was not rooted in humanitarian concern, but in the community's indispensable role as a fiscal organ, through which the monarch could indirectly tax his subjects by claiming the interest on Jewish loans. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? Within the social stratification of 11th century Leicester, this status created a complex dynamic between the Jewish community and the local Norman lords. While the Earls of Leicester exercised significant authority within the borough, the Jewish residents remained legally exempt from their feudal levies, answering instead to the royal exchequer. To facilitate this specialized taxation and legal oversight, the crown established the Exchequer of the Jews, a separate branch of the royal administration that maintained meticulous records of all Jewish debts and property. These records, known as the Rotuli Judaeorum, ensured that the state could claim its portion of any inheritance or legal fine. When a prominent Jewish lender died, the king often asserted his right to escheat, seizing a substantial percentage, sometimes a third or more, of the estate's value before allowing the heirs to settle the remainder. This system ensured a constant flow of liquid currency into the royal coffers, funding military campaigns in Normandy and the Holy Land that the traditional feudal tithing system could not sustain. Despite the relative safety provided by royal charters, the dependency on the monarch's favor introduced a systemic instability into Jewish life. The same legal principle that protected the community also empowered the king to impose arbitrary and devastating tallages or direct taxes without the consent required by the baronage. In times of fiscal crisis, the crown could squeeze the community, demanding vast sums of gold that often required the liquidation of long-term assets and the aggressive pursuit of local debtors. Furthermore, the exclusion of Jewish residents from the protection of the Magna Carta in its early iterations meant they lacked the institutional safeguards against executive overreach that the English nobility was beginning to secure. Consequently, the Jewish community of Leicester lived in a paradoxical state. They were the most legally protected subjects in the borough, yet they remained the most vulnerable to the shifting whims of a monarchy that viewed them as a renewable financial resource. This precarious balance of power would define their presence in the Midlands for generations, until the rise of a new aristocratic class challenged the king's monopoly on the Jewish property. The topographical center of medieval Leicester was defined by the High Cross, the primary intersection where the ancient north, south, east, and west gates converged. It was within this commercial nexus that the Jewish community established its primary residential and professional cluster, a district characterized by the presence of stone-built houses that stood in sharp contrast to the surrounding wattle and daub structures of the Christian burgesses. While the majority of the town's population resided in timber-frame dwellings prone to fire and decay, wealthy Jewish families utilized oolitic limestone and ironstone, often salvaged from the extensive Roman ruins that still littered the borough, to construct multi-story solar houses. These buildings typically featured a vaulted undercroft or cellar at ground level, used for the secure storage of valuables, financial ledgers, and merchandise, while the living quarters were situated on the upper floor, accessible by an external stone staircase. This architectural choice was primarily a defensive necessity, providing a fireproof sanctuary against the frequent conflagrations of the medieval urban environment and a physical barrier against civil unrest. The proximity of these houses to the high market meant that the Jewish community lived at the very heart of Leicester's logistical operations. The daily environment was defined by the arrival of regional wool merchants, drapers, and tanners who gathered at the cross to conduct trade under the supervision of the borough's guild merchant. Jewish residents were integral participants in this exchange, not merely as lenders, but as specialized providers of high-value goods and services that the local agrarian economy could not produce. Domestic life within the quarter involved a high degree of literacy and cultural distinctiveness. Archaeological finds from similar Anglo-Jewish sites reveal a material culture that included kosher dietary remains, such as the absence of porcine bones in household pits and the presence of high-quality ceramics imported from the continent. Unlike the later gated ghettos of continental Europe, the Jewish quarter in 13th century Leicester was an open, integrated part of the town's fabric, though its residents maintained their own communal infrastructure, including a school and likely a small synagogue or prayer room within one of the larger stone residences. The sonic landscape of the High Cross area was dominated by the bells of St. Martin's and St. Nicholas churches, which regulated the working hours of the medieval day. Amidst the clamor of the market, the Jewish community conducted business in Hebrew and Norman French, the latter being the common tongue of the English elite and the legal language of the royal courts. This linguistic and professional specialization allowed them to facilitate transactions between the Anglo-Norman nobility and the local English-speaking tradesmen. However, the physical visibility of their stone houses served as a constant reminder of their unique economic status and their direct connection to the crown's fiscal machinery. In an era where stone was reserved for the church and the castle, these private dwellings represented a concentration of wealth that provoked both administrative reliance and social friction. This architectural and economic presence reached its zenith in the early 13th century, just as the political winds in the earldom of Leicester began to shift toward a more exclusionary and nationalist ideology. The economic functionality of the Jewish community in 13th century Leicester was underpinned by a sophisticated system of credit and debt documentation known as the chirograph. Each financial transaction was recorded on a single sheet of parchment, which was then severed with an irregular or jagged cut, creating two matching pieces, one held by the lender and the other deposited in a localized chest, or arca. In Leicester, this arca was maintained under the supervision of 4 chirographers, 2 Jewish and 2 Christian officials, who acted as public notaries to verify the legitimacy of contracts and prevent the fabrication of debt. This dual oversight mechanism provided a level of transparency and security that allowed for the circulation of capital across the Midlands, facilitating transactions between the local landed gentry and the urban merchant class. The records kept within the arca served as a vital fiscal map for the crown, allowing the royal exchequer to accurately assess the total value of Jewish assets for the purposes of taxation and estate seizure. The capital provided by Leicester's Jewish lenders was instrumental in bridging the gap between the agrarian seasonal economy and the demand for permanent urban infrastructure. While feudal wealth was largely locked in land and produce, Jewish financiers provided the liquid bullion necessary for the construction of significant stone edifices, including granaries, mills, and expanded guild halls. These loans often took the form of rent charges or mortgages on property, where the interest provided the lender with a return on their investment, while the borrower gained the immediate means to improve their holdings. This financial engine enabled the transition of Leicester from a collection of timber dwellings into a more fortified and permanent borough. Beyond private construction, Jewish credit frequently funded the early stages of large-scale ecclesiastical projects, such as the initial expansions of St. Mary de Castro and the maintenance of the Leicester Abbey, as the church often lacked the immediate cash reserves required for masonry and specialized labor. At the national level, the fiscal integration of the Jewish community was managed by the Scaccarium Judiorum, or the Exchequer of the Jews, a specialized judicial and administrative department established within the broader Westminster bureaucracy. This body functioned as a court of law for disputes involving Jewish subjects and as an accounting office for the massive tallages imposed by the Plantagenet kings. When King Henry III required funds for his continental wars or the refurbishment of Westminster Abbey, he issued writs to the local sheriffs to seal the archaea and freeze all Jewish assets until the required sums were produced. The collection of these taxes often necessitated the sale of debts to Christian courtiers or the transfer of land titles from indebted smaller barons to more powerful magnates. This secondary market for debt fundamentally altered the tenure of land in the Leicestershire countryside, as estates frequently changed hands due to unserviced loans. Consequently, the Jewish ledger was not merely a record of private wealth, but a powerful instrument of social and territorial restructuring that defined the economic landscape of the Midlands during the middle decades of the 13th century. The political and administrative continuity of Leicester from the early 12th century was governed by the Beaumont family, a powerful Norman French dynasty that held the earldom for 4 generations. Beginning with Robert de Beaumont, the first Earl of Leicester, and a pivotal advisor to Henry I, the family established a governance model that integrated the borough's economic vitality with the strategic requirements of the Anglo-Norman state. The Beaumonts were responsible for the foundation of Leicester Abbey and the substantial enlargement of Leicester Castle, projects that demanded consistent access to the currency markets managed by Jewish financiers. This relationship was characterized by a pragmatic tolerance. While the earls were prominent patrons of the church, they recognized that the total exclusion of Jewish capital would undermine the development of their urban center and the maintenance of their military retinues. Unlike the crown, which held direct legal ownership of the Jewish community, the earls exercised an indirect authority through the regulation of the borough's trade laws and the provision of physical security within the town walls. During the tenure of Robert le Bossu, the second earl, and his successor, Robert Blanchemain, the Jewish community of Leicester became deeply embedded in the fiscal administration of the honor of Leicester. The Beaumonts often utilized Jewish intermediaries to manage the complex accounting required for their vast estates, which stretched across multiple English counties and into Normandy. This era saw the codification of the laws of Breteuil in Leicester, a set of urban privileges that fostered a burgeoning merchant class, while simultaneously delineating the specific legal enclaves occupied by non-feudal residents. The Jewish population, though directly answerable to the king's sheriff, operated with the tacit approval of the Beaumont earls, who benefited from the increased commercial traffic and the resultant tolls at the town's gates. This period of relative stability allowed for the growth of hereditary Jewish lineages in the borough, with certain families maintaining stone solar houses for decades, providing a sense of permanence that mirrored the longevity of the Beaumont dynasty itself. The transition from Beaumont rule began to manifest during the late 12th century, following the rebellion of Robert Blanchemain against Henry II. The subsequent royal confiscation of the earldom and the temporary dismantling of Leicester's fortifications disrupted the traditional power structures, forcing the Jewish community to rely more heavily on direct royal protection in an increasingly volatile political environment. When the Beaumont line eventually failed in the male line in 1204, the earldom of Leicester was divided between co-heiresses, leading to the introduction of the Montfort family into English politics. The Beaumonts had maintained a traditional, feudal approach to the Jewish presence, one defined by personal pacts and economic utility. But the new era would be defined by more abstract ideological and theological motivations. The departure of the Beaumont influence marked the end of an era of localized, pragmatic accommodation, and the beginning of a period where the Jewish community would be caught between the conflicting ambitions of the rising Montfort lords and the centralizing authority of the Plantagenet crown. The dawn of the 13th century in England was marked by the volatile reign of King John, whose administrative failures and territorial losses in Normandy precipitated a systemic fiscal and constitutional crisis. Following the loss of the Duchy of Normandy in 1204, the English monarchy faced an unprecedented need for liquid capital to fund attempted reconquests, leading to the imposition of increasingly aggressive tallages on the Jewish community. In 1210, The Bristol tallage exemplified this escalation as John ordered the imprisonment of Jewish householders across the realm, including those in Leicester, to compel the payment of 66,000 marks, a sum that far exceeded the community's traditional tax capacity. This era transformed the Jewish population from a protected fiscal resource into a primary target for royal extortion, as the crown's desperation for bullion overrode the long-term stability of the credit markets. The subsequent economic ripple effects hit the English baronage severely, as the king frequently seized Jewish-held debts to use as political leverage against his rebellious nobility. The political friction culminated in 1215 with the drafting of the Magna Carta, a document that sought to restrain the arbitrary power of the crown, but which contained specific clauses that disadvantaged Jewish creditors. Clauses 10 and 11 of the Great Charter addressed the issue of debts owed to Jews, decreeing that if a debtor died leaving an underage heir, the debt would bear no interest during the heir's minority. Furthermore, it stipulated that a widow's dower and the support of children should be prioritized over the repayment of Jewish loans. These provisions were not merely financial regulations, but were the first formal constitutional steps toward limiting the king's ability to utilize Jewish credit as a tool of royal prerogative. For the Jewish residents of Leicester, the Magna Carta signaled a dangerous shift. The English nobility was beginning to view the Jewish community's unique legal relationship with the king as a primary obstacle to their own ancestral land security and financial independence. Parallel to these constitutional upheavals, a significant ideological shift was occurring across the English realm, fueled by the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. This ecclesiastical assembly, convened by Pope Innocent III, introduced new canon laws that mandated a physical distinction between Christians and Jews, including the requirement for Jewish subjects to wear a distinguishing badge, the tabula, on their outer garments. In Leicester, as in other provincial towns, these decrees fostered a climate of social alienation that moved beyond mere economic resentment. The Church's increasing emphasis on the doctrine of perpetual servitude for Jewish people provided a theological justification for their exclusion from the developing communal privileges of the Christian burgesses. By the time King John's reign ended in 1216, the Jewish community was no longer viewed through the Beaumont-era lens of pragmatic utility. They were now caught in a kingdom where the king viewed them as a failing bank, the barons viewed them as a royal weapon, and the church viewed them as a theological pariah, creating the volatile environment into which the young Simon de Montfort would eventually arrive. The introduction of Simon de Montfort into the political landscape of 13th century England represented the arrival of a high-status French noble whose lineage was defined by the Albigensian Crusade. As the younger son of Simon de Montfort the Elder, the leader of the ecclesiastical wars against the Cathars in southern France, the younger Simon was raised in an environment of militant piety and rigorous religious orthodoxy. This background instilled in him a perception of political authority as a vehicle for moral and spiritual purification, a concept he would later apply to the administration of his English territories. In 1229, having waived his claims to his family's French estates in favor of his older brother, Simon traveled to the court of Henry III to petition for the restoration of the honor of Leicester, a vast territorial inheritance that had been largely dormant since the Beaumont line failed in 1204. His claim was initially met with skepticism by the established English baronage, who viewed him as a Poitevin or foreign interloper. Yet his genealogical legitimacy eventually secured him the title of Earl of Leicester in 1231. Upon his arrival in the Midlands, de Montfort inherited an administrative system that was still fundamentally rooted in the pragmatic, revenue-focused models of his Norman predecessors. However, his personal worldview was influenced by the emerging scholasticism of the University of Paris and a strict Franciscan-inspired asceticism that viewed social and economic relationships through the lens of Christian duty. This perspective led him to question the traditional royal reliance on Jewish credit, which he perceived not as a fiscal necessity, but as a moral corruption that burdened the Christian community. His ambition was to establish a model of pure governance within his earldom, one that aligned the physical management of the borough with the spiritual mandates of the church. This desire for political purity was not merely theoretical. It manifested in his immediate efforts to centralize his authority over the Leicester burgesses and to reform the local legal customs to reflect a more cohesive, religiously uniform society. The young earl's arrival coincided with a period of intense personal debt, as the costs of establishing a noble household and pursuing his claims at the royal court had left him financially overextended. This personal fiscal pressure created a paradoxical relationship with the very Jewish financiers he sought to exclude. While he relied on large-scale loans to fund his political rise, he increasingly identified the cancellation of such debts as a primary objective for his Christian subjects. His governance of Leicester was thus defined by a shift from the Beaumont's localized, secular administration toward a more ideological and centralized authority. By the early 1230s, de Montfort had begun to view the presence of the Jewish community in Leicester as an obstacle to his vision of an idealized, debt-free Christian borough. This ideological conviction, combined with his need to secure the unwavering loyalty of the town's merchant class, provided the strategic momentum for the radical administrative decree that would soon follow his formal investiture. The structural and social resilience of Leicester was severely tested during the First Barons' War, a conflict that erupted in the final years of King John's reign and continued into the minority of Henry III. By 1217, Leicester had become a strategic stronghold for the rebel barons who had invited Prince Louis of France to claim the English throne, placing the borough in direct opposition to the royalist forces led by William Marshal. The town's allegiance to the rebel cause was largely dictated by its lord, Simon de Montfort the Elder, whose absence on the Albigensian Crusade left the local administration in the hands of Castellans who fortified the Roman walls against a looming royalist counteroffensive. In May 1217, following the decisive royalist victory at the Battle of Lincoln, an army commanded by Ranulph de Blondeville, the Earl of Chester, marched upon Leicester to dismantle the rebel pocket in the Midlands. The subsequent siege was characterized by the intensive use of Perriers and traction trebuchets, which targeted the North Gate and the adjacent sections of the Roman masonry, inflicting structural damage that would take decades to repair. The fall of the town led to a period of systematic looting and the imposition of punitive fines known as ransoms of the peace, as royalist commanders sought to liquidate the assets of the rebellious burgesses. Documentation from the pipe rolls of the early 13th century indicates that the borough was forced to provide substantial monetary compositions to avoid total architectural demolition, a fiscal demand that exhausted the community's communal reserves. The commercial infrastructure, including the shambles and the wool-weighing stations near the High Cross, was disrupted, leading to a precipitous decline in market revenues that had previously sustained the town's prosperity. This military catastrophe necessitated a slow and arduous rebuilding process, during which the burgesses were forced to renegotiate their liberties with the crown while grappling with the physical remains of burnt timber dwellings and breached stone defenses. The destruction was so comprehensive that several parish churches reported a total loss of tithes, reflecting a significant temporary displacement of the urban population into the surrounding Leicestershire countryside. Economic recovery in the post-1217 era was hampered by the restrictive terms of the Treaty of Lambeth, which mandated the restoration of lands, but did not alleviate the debts incurred during the years of civil strife. The Leicester Guild Merchant, the primary regulatory body for local trade, found its capital reserves depleted at the very moment the town needed to invest in the repair of its river wharves and bridge infrastructure. It was within this environment of chronic insolvency and physical reconstruction that the social friction between the Christian tradesmen and the Jewish financiers began to intensify. The Jewish community, whose stone houses had largely survived the fires of the siege due to their masonry construction, became the primary source of liquid loans for the rebuilding effort. Yet this very necessity fueled an underlying resentment among the burgesses. The slow restoration of Leicester's urban spirit was thus inextricably linked to a deepening cycle of debt, creating a communal trauma that the survivors would eventually seek to resolve through the radical political shifts of the 1230s. The intensification of economic pressure during the 1220s was fueled by the standardized interest rate of 2 pence per pound per week, a figure that ensured a rapid accumulation of debt for those unable to make timely repayments. This mathematical reality created a systemic crisis for the knightly class, the minor barons and local landholders of Leicestershire, who lacked the diverse revenue streams of the high nobility. For these individuals, a relatively small loan taken to fulfill feudal obligations or equip a military retinue could quickly outpace the agricultural output of a manor, leading to a permanent encumbrance on their ancestral lands. The technical term for this was the mortgage, or dead pledge, where the land itself was locked as security and could not be alienated, improved, or passed to heirs until the obligation was discharged. This financial stagnation prevented the fluid transfer of property within the Christian social order, creating a class of disinherited knights whose professional status was undermined by their insolvency. A significant factor in the rising baronial resentment was the emergence of a secondary market for Jewish debt bonds. Large-scale magnates and royal favorites often purchased these outstanding debts from Jewish lenders, frequently at a discount, as a strategic method for territorial acquisition. Once a Christian magnate held the bond of a smaller neighbor, they could foreclose upon the property with a legal ruthlessness that the original Jewish lender, bound by royal restrictions, could not exercise. This practice, often referred to as the trafficking in bonds, effectively turned the Jewish community into an involuntary tool for the consolidation of land by the upper aristocracy. The lesser nobility of the Midlands viewed this process as a subversion of traditional feudal tenure, as it allowed wealth and land to bypass the ancient customs of primogeniture and manorial inheritance in favor of a new, cash-based reality. Within the borough of Leicester itself, the Christian burgesses organized under the guild merchant experienced a different form of friction based on jurisdictional overlap. While the Jewish residents were integral to the town's commerce, their exemption from local tolls and their direct accountability to the king's sheriff created an economic enclave that the guild could not regulate. The burgesses sought a monopoly over the town's markets and viewed the independent financial power of the Jewish quarter as an impediment to their collective bargaining power with the earl. This was compounded by a shifting moral philosophy that gained traction in the early 13th century, influenced by the Aristotelian concept that money is sterile and cannot naturally beget more of itself. This intellectual framework characterized interest-taking as an unnatural act, providing a secular rationalist veneer to the existing theological opposition to usury. By the time Simon de Montfort consolidated his power in the early 1230s, the resentment toward Jewish moneylenders had transcended simple personal debt to become a cornerstone of baronial and municipal identity. The burden of the usury was increasingly framed as a national grievance, one that united the distressed knightly class with the ambitious urban merchants in a shared desire to reclaim their lands and markets. This communal frustration provided the political energy necessary for radical administrative change, as the traditional fiscal benefits the crown derived from the Jewish community were increasingly outweighed by the threat of widespread civil unrest. In Leicester, the confluence of these class-based grievances created a volatile consensus. The removal of the Jewish presence was seen as the only definitive solution to the financial paralysis that plagued the borough and its surrounding shire. The ideological hardening of the early 13th century was significantly shaped by the theological directives of the Third Lateran Council of 1179, which had initially laid the groundwork for social segregation by prohibiting Christians from serving in Jewish households or living in close domestic proximity. This ecclesiastical momentum reached a localized peak in the 1220s through the proliferation of the mendicant orders, specifically the Franciscans and Dominicans, who established friaries within the urban centers of the Midlands. In Leicester, the Grey Friars and the Black Friars became the primary intellectual engines of a new militant orthodoxy, preaching sermons that idealized manual labor and apostolic poverty while framing financial interest as a direct violation of natural law. These friars operated as influential confessors and advisors to the high nobility, and they were instrumental in reclassifying the presence of Jewish creditors from a secular administrative matter into a profound spiritual threat. The rhetoric of the pulpit transformed the borough into a sacred Christian space where the existence of a non-sacramental enclave was portrayed as a source of divine displeasure. A critical element in this theological shift was the dissemination of the blood libel myth, which had evolved from the 12th century accusations in Norwich and Gloucester into a potent tool of popular mobilization. By the 1230s, these narratives were frequently integrated into the broader crusading fervor that permeated English religious life, particularly following the failure of the Fifth Crusade. The preaching of these missions in Leicester, often conducted in the shadow of St. Martin's and at the gates of the Leinster Abbey, created a psychological home front where the Jewish community was increasingly identified as an internal obstacle to the success of Christendom. This ideological bridge was further reinforced by Robert Grosseteste, a preeminent scholar who served as the Archdeacon of Leicester before his elevation to the bishopric of Lincoln. Grosseteste's theological treatises articulated a vision of perpetual captivity, arguing that while Jewish people should not be physically harmed, they must be made to live in a state of visible subjugation to serve as a living testament to Christian triumph. This period also witnessed the increasing influence of the Sicut Judaeus and subsequent papal bulls, which were being reinterpreted by local clergy to emphasize the contamination of the faithful. The Church began to demand that secular rulers, such as the Earl of Leicester, enforce canonical restrictions with greater rigor, including the total prohibition of Jewish physicians treating Christian patients and the ban on Jewish subjects holding any form of public office or authority over Christians. These measures were designed to create an impenetrable social and professional barrier that effectively dehumanized the community in the eyes of the local burgesses. The theological definition of a unified Christian body necessitated the amputation of any element that operated outside the Church's judicial and sacramental system. As Simon de Montfort sought to assert his legitimacy as a crusading noble, he adopted these ecclesiastical mandates as a means of demonstrating his personal orthodoxy. The whispers within the cathedral provided the administrative and moral blueprint for a society that viewed the expulsion of the Jewish community as a necessary ritual of communal purification, moving the conflict from the ledger of the exchequer to the very altar of the Church. The formal investiture of Simon de Montfort as the Earl of Leicester in August 1231 represented a definitive rupture in the administrative history of the English Midlands. To achieve this status, Simon navigated the complex legalities of the Partition of 1204, which had bifurcated the honor of Leicester into two distinct portions following the death of the last Beaumont Earl. Through a calculated negotiation with his elder brother Amaury, Simon secured the sole right to the English inheritance, a transaction that required the explicit confirmation of the Curia Regis and the personal assent of King Henry III. This legal consolidation provided Simon with the seisin, the formal possession of land and jurisdictional rights, necessary to exercise high justice and administrative oversight over the borough's burgesses. His priority upon assuming these powers was the restructuring of the town's communal identity, a project he initiated by engaging with the Communa of Leicester, the collective body of free citizens whose loyalty was essential for stable governance. The resulting royal grant of 1231 was a primary legal instrument that fundamentally redefined the residency requirements within the town walls. In this document, Simon de Montfort formally petitioned the crown and issued a charter to the burgesses, decreeing that no Jewish individual should reside within the limits of his earldom. This move was a strategic utilization of his new jurisdictional authority to fulfill a quest for what he termed a clean city, a term that signified a borough liberated from the perceived legal and fiscal complexities of the king's property. By legally stripping the borough of its Jewish residents, Simon effectively removed a royal enclave that existed outside his manorial control, thereby centralizing all legal and economic authority within his own court. This was not merely a local ordinance, but a sophisticated act of political branding. Intended to satisfy the municipal ambitions of the Leicester guild merchant, while simultaneously distancing his administration from the crown's fiscal reliance on non-Christian credit. The grant stipulated that the Jewish community must leave the borough in my time and in the time of all my heirs forever, a phrase that utilized the absolute language of medieval land law to ensure a permanent shift in the town's demographics. To validate this decree, Simon sought the confirmation of the royal court, which was granted despite the immediate loss of tax revenue to the king's exchequer. This suggests a significant political concession by Henry III, who viewed the stabilizing of de Montfort's authority in the restive Midlands as more valuable than the localized tallages of Leicester. For the burgesses, the charter was received as a liberty, a formal extension of their municipal rights that allowed them to regulate their own residency and commerce without royal interference. Consequently, the 1231 grant transformed the earldom of Leicester into a pilot project for a specific type of baronial autonomy, one where the removal of the Jewish community was the primary mechanism for establishing a singular unified jurisdiction under the earl's direct command. This legal maneuver ensured that the borough's future would be defined by a homogeneous Christian merchant class, beholden to de Montfort for their newfound exclusivity. The Charter of Exclusion, issued by Simon de Montfort in 1231, survives as a definitive example of a medieval legal quitclaim, recorded in Latin on a singular sheet of sheepskin parchment. The document opens with the traditional evidentiary formula, scient, presents et futuri, a phrase designed to address both the contemporary witnesses and all subsequent generations who would oversee the borough's administration. Unlike earlier Beaumont-era grants that offered temporary privileges, this charter utilized the absolute language of a perpetual grant, a specific legal category in English land law intended to be irrevocable. The primary provision of the text declares that nullus Judaeus neque Judea, no Jewish man or woman shall inhabit, remain, or obtain a residence within the town of Leicester. The inclusion of the gendered terms Judaeus and Judea was a precise legal redundancy, ensuring that the ban applied to the entire familial and domestic unit, thereby preventing any future legal challenges based on gendered loopholes in residency rights. The temporal scope of the ban was articulated through the phrase in tempore meo, vel in tempore aliquijus heredum meorumusque infinem mundi. In my time, or in the time of any of my heirs until the end of the world. This eschatological phrasing was not merely rhetorical. It was a technical application of the concept of mortmain, or dead hand in reverse, seeking to bind the land's demographic status even after the grantor's death. By using this specific terminology, de Montfort attempted to sever the king's customary right to relocate Jewish subjects into royal boroughs, effectively creating a jurisdictional vacuum where the crown's property could no longer be legally housed. The charter further specifies that the Communa of Leicester, the organized body of free citizens, was the primary beneficiary of this exclusion. This turned the expulsion into a contractual obligation between the earl and the borough, where the removal of the Jewish community served as the consideration or payment for the burgesses' continued political and financial support. The legitimacy of the 1231 decree was reinforced by a list of high-status witnesses whose names provided the necessary testimonium for a document of such radical social impact. Prominent among these was Stephen de Segrave, a chief justiciar of England and a primary legal architect of the era, whose signature signified that the decree did not violate the lex terra or the law of the land. The presence of such a high-ranking royal official as a witness indicates that the charter was not an act of rogue vigilantism, but a sanctioned piece of administrative engineering. This witnessing process was crucial, as it allowed the charter to be enrolled in the Great Red Book of the town, becoming a foundational piece of Leicester's municipal constitution. The document concluded with the attachment of de Montfort's personal seal in red wax, depicting him as a mounted knight, a physical symbol of the martial authority backing the legal text. By formalizing the expulsion through this specific diplomatic structure, the Earl ensured that the act was perceived not as a momentary surge of religious fervor, but as a permanent and binding alteration of the borough's corporate identity, recorded in the immutable ink of the law. The political landscape Simon de Montfort encountered upon his formal investiture in 1231 required a delicate balancing of his French knightly heritage with the localized demands of the English Midlands. As a newcomer to the English court, who initially lacked a significant power base, Simon recognized that his authority over the honor of Leicester depended on the cooperation of the Portman Moot, Leicester's ancient town court, and the influential leaders of the guild merchant. These municipal bodies had long sought to consolidate their jurisdiction over the borough's internal affairs, a goal frequently obstructed by the existence of the Jewish community, which functioned as a separate legal entity, answerable only to the king's sheriff. By granting the expulsion, de Montfort performed a calculated act of political branding. He effectively gifted the burgesses a liberty that no previous Beaumont earl had been willing to concede, thereby securing the undying loyalty of the men who controlled the town's primary revenue streams. This maneuver allowed him to transition from a foreign interloper into a champion of local rights, anchoring his tenuous baronial status in a popular municipal mandate. Financial pragmatism played a central role in this decision, as the removal of Jewish creditors effectively functioned as an informal debt-clearing mechanism for the town's elite. While the crown utilized Jewish tallages to fund national military operations, the Earl of Leicester sought to redirect the borough's taxable potential toward his own seigneurial treasury. By eliminating the competition posed by Jewish capital, de Montfort ensured that the Christian merchants of the guild merchant held an undisputed monopoly over the local credit markets and the wool trade. This economic protectionism was codified in the Charter of the Friday Market, where Simon further refined the town's commercial laws to favor the burgesses who had supported his residency decree. The fiscal reality was that the Earl could extract more consistent auxilia, or feudal aid, from a grateful and prosperous Christian merchant class than he could from a Jewish community that was constantly being depleted by royal extortion. Furthermore, Simon's motivations were inextricably linked to his desire to consolidate the honor of Leicester into a single seamless administrative unit. The existence of a group that operated under royal prerogative rather than his own manorial justice was viewed as a libertas in libertate, a liberty within a liberty that diluted his regional power. The expulsion was thus a sophisticated exercise in jurisdictional centralism, allowing him to enforce the assize of bread and ale and other municipal regulations without the interference of royal clerks who managed Jewish affairs. This administrative cleaning of the city allowed for the implementation of the Leicester customary, a revised body of local law that synchronized the borough's judicial practices with de Montfort's own court. The Earl's political opportunism was masked by a veneer of crusading zeal, allowing him to frame a cold-blooded administrative restructuring as a pursuit of Christian moral order. Ultimately, the motivation of the Baron was defined by the transition from a feudal lord to a modernizing administrator who sought to govern a unified, homogeneous body of subjects. By removing the Jewish population, de Montfort eliminated the primary conduit for royal interference in his earldom's internal economy, creating a pilot project for the type of baronial independence that would later define his leadership during the Second Barons' War. The Act of 1231 was his political dowry to the borough, a decisive gesture that transformed the traditional relationship between lord and town into a mutual partnership based on the exclusion of the other. This synthesis of personal piety and hard-edged political realism ensured that while the king lost a source of revenue, the Earl gained a fortified political stronghold in the heart of England. Populated by a merchant class whose fortunes were now entirely dependent on his continued protection, the transition of the 1231 Charter from a private legal document to an active administrative mandate was achieved through the Preconium, the formal public proclamation conducted by the borough criers. In medieval Leicester, this process was initiated by the sounding of the common horn, a ritual instrument used to summon the burgesses to the portmanteau or to announce significant changes in the town's assize. The proclamation was read aloud at the High Cross, the commercial epicenter of the borough, and repeated at the four main gates, north, south, east, and west, to ensure that the change in residency law reached both the permanent inhabitants and the transient merchants. The criers utilized a dual-language delivery, presenting the decree in Norman French for the municipal elite and in Middle English for the general populace, a linguistic necessity that highlighted the Earl's intent to secure universal compliance with the new racial and religious boundary. This act of vocalizing the law effectively terminated the Jewish community's legal right to stay and hearth within the borough, initiating an immediate grace period for the liquidation of movable property. The administrative center of the expulsion was the Leicester Arca, the chest containing the chirographs or debt records, which was immediately placed under the guard of the Earl's bailiffs and the king's sheriff. Upon the reading of the decree, all ongoing financial transactions were legally suspended, and the chirographers were ordered to cease the registration of new debts involving Jewish lenders. This freezing of assets was a critical step in preventing the clandestine transfer of capital out of the borough, as the Earl's stewards began the systematic inventory of Jewish-held real estate. The stone houses of the quarter, which represented a significant portion of the town's high-value infrastructure, were appraised for their potential conversion into municipal or baronial use. This valuation process was conducted by the praepositi, or town provosts, who recorded the dimensions and structural condition of each solar house in a special role for the Earl's treasury, effectively transitioning these private dwellings into the Earl's domain. In the Jewish quarter itself, the proclamation triggered the immediate cessation of communal life, as the legal protections previously afforded by the royal sheriff were now subordinate to de Montfort's local jurisdiction. The inhabitants were forced to resolve outstanding domestic obligations under the supervision of the borough bailiffs, who ensured that the king's property was not damaged during the process of packing movable goods. This period was characterized by the hurried settlement of minor debts and the disposal of household items that could not be transported in the limited cartage available. Unlike the chaotic pogroms of 1190, the 1231 expulsion in Leicester was a disciplined, bureaucratic operation. The violence was not physical, but structural, manifested in the total and permanent invalidation of the Jewish community's right to exist as a corporate body within the town. The stillness of the High Cross following the proclamation was the result of a sudden economic vacuum as the sophisticated networks of credit and international trade that had defined the market's operation for over a century were abruptly severed. By sunset on the day of the crier's announcement, the Jewish residents had become aliens of the borough, their status reduced from protected fiscal agents to a displaced population whose presence in Leicester was now a criminal act. The logistics of the 1231 expulsion were governed by the legal distinction between immovables, which reverted to the Earl's domain, and movables, or chattels, which the exiles were theoretically permitted to retain. This forced an immediate transition from a settled existence in stone solar houses to a transient life dependent on the capacity of a medieval pack horse or a two-wheeled ox cart. Medieval transport was strictly limited by the topographical constraints of the Fosse Way. A standard cart could carry approximately 500 to 1,000 pounds of weight, meaning that bulky household furniture, heavy ironware, and large-scale grain stores were frequently abandoned to the borough's bailiffs. The primary focus of the exiles was the preservation of liquid wealth, specifically gold and silver bullion, alongside high-value portable goods such as silk textiles and worked metal. This necessitated the conversion of fixed domestic assets into portable currency, a process often conducted at a significant loss under the pressurized conditions of a forced sale. Sacred artifacts occupied the most guarded portions of the baggage, including the Torah scrolls, which were parchment manuscripts of immense spiritual and material value. The physical transport of these scrolls required protective cases of wood or leather, as the vulnerability of organic materials to the Midlands' damp climate posed a constant threat to the community's cultural continuity. Ritual objects, such as bronze lamps and silver spice containers, were prioritized over utilitarian domestic items like heavy pottery or wooden bedding. However, many elements of Jewish life were inextricably linked to the earth and could not be relocated. The most significant of these were the mikvaot, the ritual baths constructed deep within the undercrofts of the high cross houses. These baths, requiring a constant flow of living water from natural springs or Roman-era conduits, were structurally integrated into the masonry and remained as silent witnesses to a vacated culture. Archaeological evidence from similar 13th century expulsions suggests that many families resorted to concealment as a strategy for an anticipated eventual return. Small caches of coins, silver plate, and personal jewelry have been discovered hidden beneath floorboards or within the thick wall cavities of medieval stone dwellings, representing emergency hoards that were never reclaimed. These lost artifacts provide a data-driven map of the desperation that accompanied the exit from Leicester, highlighting a lack of faith in the long-term stability of royal safe conducts. To facilitate the movement of the population toward the larger Jewish communities of London and Oxford, the King's Sheriff issued formal writs of protection. These documents were essential for travel along the King's Highway, as they exempted the exiles from certain transit tolls and provided a legal deterrent against robbery, though the actual efficacy of these protections was often undermined by localized hostility. The final exit from the borough was an exercise in demographic depletion, as the approximately 15 households that comprised the Leicester community were removed in a single coordinated movement. This shift left behind an intact physical quarter, a ghost district of stone, which de Montfort immediately utilized to reward his loyal Christian subordinates. The loss to the earth was not merely archaeological, but professional. The specialized knowledge of international trade routes and continental financial markets was effectively expunged from the town's administrative memory. As the carts moved south toward the borough boundary, the exiles left behind a city that had been their home for generations. Their history now reduced to the items buried in the soil and the vacant stone walls that Simon de Montfort would soon reassign to his own knights. The departure of the Jewish community from Leicester through the South Gate in 1231 marked a definitive transition from the localized jurisdiction of the Earl to the broader, more volatile administration of the King's Highway, or Via Regia. This gate, a massive stone edifice that had stood since the Roman era and was reinforced during the Norman consolidation, served as the primary threshold between the borough's guild-controlled economy and the rural expanse of Leicestershire. As the exiles crossed the threshold of the South Gate, they entered the territory of the county, where the legal authority of Simon de Montfort ended and the responsibility for their physical safety shifted entirely to the king's sheriff and the officials of the royal forest. The Fosse Way, the ancient Roman military road, provided the primary logistical artery for this movement, stretching southwest toward the regional hubs of High Cross and eventually toward the larger Jewish communities in Oxford and London. Travel along the 13th century Fosse Way was governed by the laws of the King's Peace, which theoretically provided protection to all subjects traveling on the four great Roman roads of England. For the displaced Jewish families, this protection was codified in the Letters of Safe Conduct provided by the Royal Chancery, documents that were presented to the keepers of the various bridges and river crossings along the route. These letters were essential for avoiding the passage and pontage tolls that were typically levied on commercial traffic, as the exiles were traveling as displaced subjects of the crown rather than active merchants. The journey toward the southeast required navigating the heavy clay soils of the Midlands, where the Roman-metalled surface of the road had often been obscured by centuries of erosion and local encroachment. The pace of travel was dictated by the speed of heavily laden ox carts, which typically covered between 15 and 18 miles per day, necessitating nightly stops at designated inns or sheltered sites that operated under royal license. The destination for many of the Leicester exiles was Northampton, a major administrative center for the exchequer of the Jews and one of the largest provincial juries in England. This town, located approximately 30 miles to the south, offered an established arca and a functional synagogue where the legal and religious life of the community could be resumed. However, the move into these larger urban centers required the payment of entry fines and the formal registration of residency with the local bailiffs, a process that further depleted the community's remaining liquid reserves. Outside the borough walls of Leicester, the exiles also faced the rising influence of the forest laws, which restricted movement through royal hunting grounds and increased the visibility of the population to local rangers and castellans who might not respect the validity of royal safe-conducts. This migration represented a significant demographic shift in the Midlands, as the removal of a permanent Jewish presence in Leicester forced a reconfiguration of regional credit networks. While the exiles moved toward the security of larger communal enclaves, they left behind the localized protection of the Earl, a relationship that, while often exploitative, had provided a predictable framework for existence for over a century. The uncertainty of the open road was not merely a physical hazard, but a legal one. Once detached from their specific High Cross residences, the Jewish subjects became wanderers in the king's domain, their legal standing reduced to a transient status that made them increasingly vulnerable to the shifting political alliances of the royal court. By the time the final carts from Leicester reached the borders of Northamptonshire, the community had been transformed from a fixed economic pillar of a Midland borough into a refugee population seeking sanctuary in an increasingly hostile and segregated kingdom. London's Old Jewry, located in the vicinity of the Guildhall and the parish of St. Olavi, served as the primary destination for the displaced families from Leicester. Unlike the provincial cluster at High Cross, the London Jewry was a dense metropolitan enclave characterized by a high concentration of stone-built structures and a complex social hierarchy that included the kingdom's most prominent financiers and rabbinical scholars. Upon arrival at the city gates, the exiles were required to present their royal safe-conducts to the constable of the Tower, who exercised supreme jurisdictional authority over all Jewish subjects within the capital's liberties. This administrative oversight ensured that the king's property was accurately accounted for and integrated into the city's tax rolls. But it also placed the refugees in a state of absolute surveillance. The Tower of London functioned as more than a royal palace. It was a physical sanctuary of last resort, where the Jewish population could flee in times of civil unrest, provided they remained under the strict fiscal control of the crown. The housing of the Leicester refugees within the Old Jewry created significant logistical strain, as existing households were forced to accommodate multiple families within dwellings already taxed to their physical limits. This overcrowding was a legal necessity, as Jewish residence was strictly confined to specific parishes to facilitate the collective assessment of the royal tallage. Historical records from the 1230s indicate a marked increase in the issuance of subtenancy agreements within the London quarter, where established metropolitan families provided shelter to their provincial kinsmen in exchange for a portion of their remaining liquid assets. This internal migration led to the formation of urban refugee clusters within the masonry walls of the Jewry, where the former elite of Leicester lived in a state of professional suspension, unable to re-establish their regional monopolies and increasingly dependent on metropolitan credit networks for their basic survival. Economic integration was managed through the London Archa, the largest repository of debt bonds in the British Isles. Here, the former lenders of the Midlands were required to re-register their outstanding claims, a process that often involved the forced liquidation of provincial debts to London-based magnates at a steep discount. This centralization of capital served the interests of Henry III, who could more efficiently extract wealth from the community when it was concentrated under the shadow of the Tower. The fragile protection offered by the king was conditional upon the community's ability to satisfy the escalating demands of the royal treasury, which viewed the influx of provincial refugees as a temporary boost to the city's taxable capacity. Consequently, the social life of the Leicester exiles in London was defined by a profound sense of precariousness. While they were physically safer from de Montfort's exclusionary decrees, they were now subject to the systemic fiscal demands of a monarchy desperate for bullion. Furthermore, the presence of the refugees coincided with heightened municipal tension, as the London guilds, far more powerful than those in Leicester, viewed the growth of the Jewry with suspicion. The city's burgesses frequently petitioned the crown to limit the professional activities of the newcomers, seeking to prevent the Leicester financiers from entering the capital's lucrative wool and wine trades. This created a dual layer of exclusion. The refugees were legally barred from their original homes and professionally restricted in their new sanctuary. The London experience for the Leicester exiles was thus one of institutionalized transit, where the refugee camp was not a collection of tents, but a network of crowded stone garrets, and where the promise of royal safety was a ledger-based reality that could be revoked at the first sign of a financial deficit. By the mid-1230s, the survivors of the Leicester expulsion had become a permanent part of the capital's disenfranchised urban underclass, their regional identity slowly dissolving into the collective struggle of the Anglo-Jewish community under the late Plantagenet kings. The immediate reaction of King Henry III to the 1231 expulsion from Leicester was one of profound administrative and jurisdictional alarm. From the perspective of the Plantagenet monarchy, the Jewish population was not merely a religious minority, but a vital element of the prerogativa regis, the unique set of rights and assets belonging exclusively to the crown. By summarily removing the Jewish community from his borough, Simon de Montfort had effectively performed an unauthorized seizure of royal property, an act that challenged the fundamental legal principle that only the king could dispose of his chattels. The royal chancery viewed this independent action as a dangerous precedent. If a provincial earl could unilaterally dissolve a royal fiscal enclave, the crown's ability to maintain its national credit system would be fundamentally compromised. Consequently, the king's initial response was a formal legal protest issued through the Curia Regis, asserting that de Montfort had exceeded the bounds of his seigneurial authority. The core of the king's protest centered on the loss of the tallage, the arbitrary tax that provided the monarchy with immediate liquid bullion. When the Leicester Jews were driven out, they were removed from the local tax rolls managed by the king's sheriff, creating a permanent deficit in the royal accounts for the Midlands. The barons of the exchequer, the high-ranking officials responsible for the king's finances, argued that the earl had diminished the crown by depriving it of its most taxable subjects without providing a commensurate financial indemnity. This fiscal tension was exacerbated by the status of the Arca of Leicester, since the records of debt were now physically separated from the community that generated them. The king's ability to collect on escheated estates or unpaid fines was severely hampered. The royal court viewed the expulsion as a form of purpresture, an illegal encroachment on royal rights, demanding a full inquiry into the earl's legal standing. Furthermore, the conflict highlighted a burgeoning constitutional rift between the king's centralizing ambitions and the growing desire for baronial autonomy. Henry III, who was deeply invested in his own image as a pious Christian monarch, found himself in the paradoxical position of defending the presence of Jewish lenders against a noble who claimed to be acting out of religious zeal. The king's ministers pointed to the Charter of the Jews issued by King John in 1201, which confirmed the community's right to live in designated royal boroughs, arguing that no provincial charter could supersede a standing royal decree. This debate turned the Leicester expulsion into a test case for the limits of feudal jurisdiction. It forced the royal courts to define exactly where the earl's authority over his burgesses ended and the king's authority over his property began. The resolution of this protest required a complex political negotiation that reflected the shifting power dynamics of the 1230s. Henry III eventually conceded to de Montfort's action, but only after a formal confirmation process that reinforced the king's role as the ultimate arbiter of English law. By confirming the expulsion rather than simply allowing it to stand, the king reasserted his ownership of the Jewish subjects, framing the event as a royal favor granted to the earl rather than an independent right exercised by a subject. This administrative compromise allowed the king to save face while simultaneously acknowledging that the political stability of the Midlands now depended on the loyalty of de Montfort and the Leicester burgesses. The protest of the king thus ended not in a reversal of the decree, but in a formal redefinition of the king's property, signaling the beginning of an era where royal rights were increasingly bartered for baronial support in a kingdom approaching civil war. The immediate consequence of the 1231 decree was the comprehensive consolidation of economic and judicial power by the Leicester Guild Merchant, the primary corporate body of the town's Christian tradesmen. For decades, the presence of an independent Jewish financial enclave had acted as a structural counterweight to the guild's ambitions, as Jewish lenders operated under royal licenses that exempted them from the borough's customary tolls and market regulations. With the removal of these competitors, the burgesses achieved a total monopoly over the town's internal credit markets and the lucrative regional trade in wool and grain. This shift allowed the guild to implement the law of the portmanteau with unprecedented rigor, ensuring that all commercial transactions were filtered through their own regulatory framework without the interference of non-guild intermediaries. The celebratory nature of this transition was rooted in the sudden elimination of the libertas that had previously allowed Jewish residents to bypass the guild's restrictive membership fees and trade barriers. A pivotal element of this municipal victory was the widespread suspension and renegotiation of outstanding debts that had burdened the town's leading families. While the crown technically maintained a claim on many Jewish-held bonds through the Scicarium Judiorum, the physical absence of the creditors in Leicester so made the day-to-day collection of interest nearly impossible for royal clerks. This administrative vacuum allowed the Leicester burgesses to petition the Earl for favorable settlements, leading to the quietus, or legal discharge of numerous obligations that had previously threatened the solvency of the town's merchant elite. Historical records from the borough's vills indicate a significant decrease in the number of property foreclosures during the early 1230s, as the removal of Jewish lenders effectively acted as a localized bankruptcy relief for the Christian community. The cancellation of these debts provided the town's merchants with a sudden influx of disposable capital, which was immediately reinvested into the expansion of the shambles, the dedicated market stalls, and the fortification of the town's riverfront infrastructure. The redistribution of vacated Jewish assets provided a tangible material reward for the burgesses who had supported de Montfort's exclusionary policy. The stone solar houses near the High Cross, which represented the highest tier of civilian architecture in the borough, were not left to decay. Instead, they were formally regranted by the Earl to his most loyal Christian subordinates and prominent guild members. This transfer of real estate fundamentally altered the social geography of the town, as the former Jewish quarter was integrated into the commonalty of the town, and its high-quality masonry dwellings became the prestigious residences of the new municipal elite. The transition was recorded in the Leicester Borough Records as a restoration of communal rights, where property that had been alienated under royal protection was returned to the jurisdiction of the town's burgesses. Furthermore, the guild merchant utilized this moment of ascendancy to refine the assize of trade, establishing new ordinances that prohibited any future non-guild members from engaging in retail commerce within the town walls. This ensured that the economic vacuum left by the expulsion was filled exclusively by the established Christian families, preventing any new demographic groups from gaining a foothold in the borough's financial life. The victory of the burgesses was thus not merely the removal of a religious minority, but the successful implementation of a closed market system that prioritized the hereditary rights of the guild members over the fiscal requirements of the royal treasury. By the end of 1232, the administrative and social landscape of Leicester had been entirely reconfigured. The borough was now a singular self-regulating corporate entity, governed by a merchant class whose wealth was fortified by the seizure of their former creditors' assets and the permanent elimination of their debts. The post-1231 environment of the High Cross district was defined by a profound structural stasis. As the specific cluster of masonry solar houses that had anchored the town's credit economy entered a period of administrative dormancy, while the timber-framed dwellings of the Christian burgesses in the surrounding parishes remained active centers of domestic life, the stone quarter became a series of silent, fireproof shells. The architectural durability of these buildings, which utilized oolitic limestone and Roman spolia salvaged from the ruins of Ratai, ensured that they remained as permanent monuments to the displacement. In the absence of their inhabitants, the internal hall space of the solar, the primary living area situated above the vaulted undercrofts, became a void where the cultural and linguistic markers of the Jewish community had been systematically erased. The hearths, which historically functioned as the ritual and thermal center of the home, were left to cold ash, symbolizing the finality of the extinction of residency mandated by the Earl's decree. The physical state of these abandoned homes was documented through a process of seigneurial session, where de Montfort's bailiffs conducted a room-by-room inventory to identify any remaining fixtures or concealed assets. This survey ensured that the structural improvements made by the Jewish families over the previous century, such as stone-lined chimneys and integrated drainage systems, were preserved for future regranting. The administrative sealing of the doors represented more than a security measure. It was a formal legal act that signaled the property's transition from the king's protected enclave into the Earl's private domain. Archaeological investigations into such periods of urban vacancy often reveal a destruction layer, not of fire, but of absence, a stratigraphic gap where the lack of new ceramic deposits and animal bone waste indicates a sudden cessation of human metabolic activity within the site. In Leicester, the stone houses near the jury wall stood as hollow conduits between the Roman past and the medieval future, their vaulted cellars no longer serving as secure repositories for financial ledgers or Mediterranean imports. The sonic landscape of the vacated district was defined by the absence of the Hebrew liturgy and the specific professional registers of the moneylenders that had previously characterized the High Cross. This silence facilitated a psychological distancing between the town's remaining Christian population and the physical remains of the Jewish presence. The local parish churches, such as St. Nicholas and St. Martin, continued to regulate the hours of the day with their bells, but their tolling now echoed through a district that had become an excluded zone of the borough. The Inquisition of the Void, an ad hoc survey of abandoned lands, noted that the vacancy of these high-status buildings represented a significant temporary loss in the town's watch and ward capacity, as the most fortified houses in the northern quadrant were now unmanned. The transformation of the quarter was completed by the removal of the specific material markers of the Jewish faith, such as the mezuzot from the doorposts and the specialized kitchenware required for kosher dietary laws. These items, often discarded or destroyed during the final exit, became part of the archaeological record of the borough's soil, while the stone buildings themselves awaited their new Christian occupants. The eerie silence of the vacated quarter was the result of a deliberate administrative choice to amputate a vital limb of the town's social and economic body. By the end of 1231, the empty streets of the Jewish quarter were no longer a living neighborhood, but a strategic asset, a collection of cold masonry that Simon de Montfort would soon utilize to reward the knights and officials who formed the backbone of his expanding baronial power. The administrative success of the 1231 expulsion provided Simon de Montfort with a repeatable blueprint for the subversion of royal authority through localized populist mandates. This event represented the first time the young earl successfully navigated the tension between seigneurial rights and royal prerogative, demonstrating that the crown's fiscal assets could be dismantled if the act was presented as a benefit to the broader Christian community. By prioritizing the economic grievances of the Leicester burgesses over the king's tax revenue, de Montfort established a political methodology that he would later expand to a national scale during the reform movement of the 1250s. He recognized that the cancellation of debt and the removal of alien financial influences were potent tools for securing the unwavering loyalty of the communitas bachileriae, the lesser knights and landholders whose support was essential for any challenge to the Plantagenet monarchy. The 1231 experiment in Leicester served as the foundational precursor to the provisions of Oxford in 1258, specifically in the way it utilized legal charters to institutionalize baronial control over local administration. In Leicester, de Montfort had learned that municipal partnerships were more stable than traditional feudal alliances. By granting the townspeople the liberty of an exclusive market, he turned the borough into a fortified political and financial stronghold. This strategy reached its ideological zenith in 1264 and 1265, when, as the de facto ruler of England, Simon summoned the first parliament to include representatives from the boroughs alongside the knights of the shires. This inclusion was not an abstract democratic impulse, but a refined version of the alliance he had forged at the High Cross, where the urban merchant class was elevated into the political process to provide a counterbalance to the royalist nobility. Furthermore, the Leicester expulsion refined de Montfort's use of nationalist rhetoric as a mechanism for political purification. His early efforts to clean the borough of Jewish residents evolved into a broader campaign against the Poitevins and Lusignans, the king's foreign relatives who held influential positions at court. In both instances, de Montfort framed the exclusion of a specific group as a necessary step for the restoration of ancient English liberties and the protection of the land from foreign exploitation. This ideological consistency allowed him to transform personal political ambitions into a sacred cause, appealing to a sense of English identity that united the distressed knightly class with the ambitious urban guilds. The fiscal autonomy he achieved in 1231, by redirecting the borough's taxable potential toward his own treasury, became the model for his later attempts to place the king's household under the supervision of a baronial council. Ultimately, the events in Leicester proved that the king's property, whether in the form of Jewish subjects or royal officials, was vulnerable to a sufficiently organized local opposition. Simon de Montfort's rise as the leader of the baronial opposition was anchored in the realization that the monarchy's power was fundamentally dependent on the compliance of the provincial administrators. The 1231 decree was the first link in a chain of constitutional defiance that led directly to the Battle of Lewes, where the same municipal and knightly interests that had been galvanized in the Midlands were mobilized to overthrow the royal army. By the time de Montfort fell at the Battle of Evesham, the Leicester model of governance, defined by an alliance between the high nobility and the urban commons, had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the English Parliament, ensuring that the voice of the burgesses would remain a permanent factor in the kingdom's legislative history. The intellectual and spiritual foundations of Simon de Montfort's governance were profoundly shaped by his relationship with Robert Grosseteste, the preeminent scholar bishop of the 13th century, who served as the Bishop of Lincoln and the Earl's primary confessor. Grosseteste, a former archdeacon of Leicester and a pioneer in the fields of optics, mathematics, and scholastic theology, viewed the administration of a medieval earldom as a sacred duty that required the alignment of secular law with the divine order of the Church. This mentor-disciple relationship provided de Montfort with a rigorous theoretical framework for his political actions, transforming localized municipal decisions into components of a broader Christian commonwealth. Central to this vision was the reform of the res publica, a concept Grosseteste derived from both Aristotelian ethics and Augustinian theology, which posited that a ruler's primary obligation was the spiritual health of his subjects. The specific theological justification for the exclusion of the Jewish community was articulated in Grosseteste's Epistola Fibifimbi, a seminal letter written to Margaret de Quincey, the Countess of Winchester, who held significant dower lands in the vicinity of Leicester. In this document, Grosseteste addressed the 1231 expulsion directly, articulating a doctrine of perpetual servitude that drew upon the writings of the Church Fathers. He argued that while Jewish subjects should not be physically harmed or forcibly converted, they must be relegated to a state of visible subjugation, performing manual labor as a living testament to the triumph of Christianity. Grosseteste's thesis was that the presence of Jewish financiers, whom he characterized as vultures, preying upon the Christian poor, was a symptom of a disordered state. He warned secular rulers that by profiting from Jewish tallages and usury, they were effectively participating in the sin of the moneylender, a spiritual contagion that threatened the salvation of the nobility. This partnership introduced a new level of administrative rigor to the earldom of Leicester, as Grosseteste's rules for the management of estates emphasized the importance of self-sufficiency and the elimination of external debt. The bishop's influence encouraged de Montfort to view his seigneurial treasury not as a private fund for military expansion, but as a public trust that must remain untainted by non-Christian credit. This ideological stance necessitated the systematic replacement of Jewish capital with internal Christian revenue streams, a process that Grosseteste supported through his promotion of the mendicant orders and the reform of the parish clergy. The vision they shared was one of a hermetic Christian society where every economic transaction and legal contract operated within the jurisdictional boundaries of the sacramental system. Furthermore, Grosseteste's influence provided de Montfort with the intellectual tools to challenge royal authority on moral grounds. The bishop's belief in the plenitudo potestatis, the fullness of power, tempered by the requirement for a ruler to act for the common utility, became the basis for Simon's later constitutional arguments. By framing the expulsion in Leicester as a necessary act of spiritual cleaning, requested by the bishop, de Montfort was able to present his defiance of the king's fiscal rights as an act of superior religious obedience. The partnership between the earl and the bishop thus created a unique political laboratory in the Midlands, where the expulsion of 1231 served as the practical application of a high medieval theology that sought to create an exclusive, homogeneous, and disciplined Christian society. This collaboration ensured that de Montfort's actions in Leicester were perceived not as arbitrary baronial cruelty, but as the vanguard of a sophisticated reform movement that intended to reshape the very soul of the English state. The 1231 expulsion from Leicester functioned as a legislative pilot program that demonstrated the feasibility of a state-sanctioned removal of Jewish populations to a skeptical royal administration. Over the following decades, this localized precedent was systematically emulated by other provincial boroughs, seeking to consolidate their municipal liberties and eliminate internal financial competition. In 1234, the borough of Newcastle upon Tyne successfully petitioned the Crown for a similar exclusion, followed by Wycombe in 1235 and Southampton in 1236. These individual grants created a patchwork of Jew-free zones across England, effectively concentrating the Jewish population into a diminishing number of royal tallage cities, such as London, York, and Lincoln. This demographic compression was a deliberate administrative strategy. By funneling the community into a few high-surveillance urban centers, the Crown could more efficiently manage the Scacarium Judiorum, while pacifying the regional barons who viewed the Jewish presence as a tool of royal encroachment. The momentum toward national expulsion intensified during the reign of Edward I, whose approach to the Jewish question was defined by a transition from fiscal exploitation to total social elimination. The Statute of the Jury, enacted in 1275, represented the final legal death knell for the community's traditional role in the English economy. This landmark legislation formally outlawed usury in all its forms, stripping Jewish subjects of their primary means of generating the bullion required to satisfy royal tallages. The statute attempted to force the community into manual labor or overseas trade, activities from which they were already effectively barred by the powerful Christian guilds that de Montfort had empowered in Leicester. This created a systemic insolvency that made the Jewish population a liability to the royal treasury rather than an asset, as the costs of providing protection began to outweigh the dwindling tax yields. A significant catalyst for the final move toward national banishment was the political influence of Eleanor of Provence, the Queen Mother, who had been a vocal proponent of Jewish exclusion since her own expulsion of the Jews from her dower lands in 1275. Her advocacy, combined with Edward I's need for an unprecedentedly large tax from Parliament to fund his Welsh and Scottish wars, created the conditions for a grand political bargain. In 1290, Edward realized that the English commons and the knightly class would willingly grant a massive 15th tax on all movable property in exchange for the total removal of the Jewish presence from the realm. This trade-off mirrored de Montfort's 1231 tactic on a national scale. The king sacrificed a failing royal property to secure a massive one-time influx of cash from his Christian subjects. The Edict of Expulsion, issued in July 1290, was the ultimate expansion of the widening gyre that had begun at the High Cross of Leicester. This decree mandated that all Jewish subjects, numbering approximately 3,000 individuals, must leave England by the Feast of All Saints. The administrative mechanisms utilized for this national exodus were refined versions of the protocols established in Leicester: the freezing of the archy, the inventory of stone real estate for royal seizure, and the provision of temporary safe conducts to the coast. The 1231 Leicester Charter was the primary legal ancestor of the 1290 Edict, providing the structural blueprint for a kingdom that sought to define its national identity through the total exclusion of its non-Christian subjects. By the end of the 13th century, the clean city envisioned by Simon de Montfort had evolved into a clean kingdom, setting a precedent for religious and ethnic expulsion that would resonate throughout European history for centuries to come. The structural withdrawal of Jewish capital from Leicester in the years following 1231 necessitated an immediate and often destabilizing realignment of the borough's fiscal networks. While the Christian burgesses had celebrated the removal of their primary competitors, they quickly encountered a localized liquidity crisis that impeded the velocity of trade within the Midlands. The Jewish community had provided a specific form of petty credit, small-scale, high-frequency loans that sustained the seasonal operations of drapers, tanners, and smallhold farmers. In their absence, the supply of liquid currency in the high cross market contracted, forcing the Leicester Guild merchant to seek alternative sources of financing to maintain the borough's commercial momentum. This vacuum was eventually filled by the Cahorsins, merchants from the French city of Cahors, and the Lombards from Italian city-states such as Lucca, Florence, and Siena, who introduced more complex but often more distant financial instruments to the English economy. These Italian merchant societies, such as the Riccardi and the Bonsignori, operated on a fundamentally different model than the displaced Jewish lenders. While the Jewish residents had been integrated into the town's social fabric as permanent householders, the Italians functioned as transient agents of massive international conglomerates, focusing primarily on wholesale credit and the macro-level financing of the royal wardrobe. For the local gentry of Leicestershire, this shift meant that credit was no longer accessible through localized face-to-face negotiations at the High Cross. Instead, borrowing became an impersonal administrative process governed by the lex mercatoria, or merchant law. The interest rates, while ostensibly lower than the regulated Jewish rates, were often hidden within penalties for late payment to circumvent canonical prohibitions against usury, leading to a more opaque and less predictable financial environment for the Leicestershire knightly class. The most significant unintended consequence was the disruption of the regional wool production cycle, which served as the primary engine of Leicester's wealth. Jewish lenders had frequently engaged in forward purchasing, providing advance capital to monasteries and sheep farmers to cover the costs of shearing and transport in exchange for a guaranteed portion of the future clip. This system ensured a steady flow of raw materials to the looms of Flanders and provided local producers with the cash required for their own feudal obligations. With the collapse of these localized credit links, many smaller monastic houses and manorial estates faced a capital gap, leading to a temporary decline in the volume of wool exported through the borough's wharves. The adaptation to this loss required the Leicester Guild merchant to internalize these financial functions, leading to the development of the Common Chest, a communal fund designed to provide mutual credit to its members, though it rarely matched the liquidity once provided by the Jewish community. Furthermore, the disappearance of the Jewish financial network resulted in a loss of specialized market intelligence. The Jewish families of the Midlands had maintained extensive kinship and professional ties with the continental Jewries of Rouen and Paris, providing Leicester with a direct conduit to European price fluctuations and luxury goods markets. The replacement of these networks with Italian agents shifted the borough's economic orientation toward the Mediterranean and the papacy, fundamentally altering the town's geopolitical significance. By the middle of the 13th century, Leicester's economy had adapted to a more homogeneous, guild-controlled reality, but it remained more vulnerable to national fiscal shocks than it had been under the diversified credit system of the Beaumont era. The economic decay was not a collapse of trade, but a narrowing of its potential, as the borough traded the sophisticated diversity of an international credit enclave for the rigid protectionism of a closed merchant monopoly. The archaeological identification of the medieval synagogue in Leicester, often referred to in contemporary Latin documents as the Schola Iudiorum, remains one of the primary challenges for the study of the borough's 13th century topography. Unlike the surviving stone houses in Lincoln or Bury St. Edmunds, no standing structure in Leicester has been definitively confirmed as a place of Jewish communal worship. In medieval England, a school or synagogue was rarely a purpose-built ecclesiastical edifice. Rather, it was frequently situated within one of the larger private stone-built solar houses, functioning as a multi-purpose center for education, prayer, and judicial assembly. Archaeological surveys conducted near the St. Nicholas Circle and the High Cross suggests that such a building would have been located within the northern quadrant of the town walls, integrated into the residential cluster of the Jewish quarter. The lack of distinct architectural markers for these sites is a direct result of their domestic nature, as they were designed to be indistinguishable from the high-status dwellings of the Christian nobility to minimize visibility and potential desecration. The most prominent physical association with the medieval community is the Jewry Wall, a massive fragment of Roman masonry that stands adjacent to St. Nicholas Church. However, modern archaeological analysis has clarified that this structure was never part of a Jewish building. It is actually the surviving western wall of the Roman palaestra, or exercise hall, from the 2nd century bath complex of Ratae Coriel Tauvorum. The name Jewry Wall is a post-medieval toponym, first recorded in the 17th century, reflecting a residual cultural memory of the medieval Jewry district that had once existed in its shadow. The name serves as a linguistic fossil, preserving the geographic location of the Jewish quarter long after its inhabitants were expelled. The physical proximity of this Roman relic to the medieval Jewish solar houses suggests that the community utilized the ancient masonry as a ready source of building material or as a natural boundary for their district, a common practice in towns where Roman infrastructure still dictated the medieval street plan. The search for the community's burial grounds, the Cemeterium Judaeorum, reveals a significant logistical constraint of the early 13th century. Prior to the royal concession of 1177, which permitted provincial Jewish communities to establish their own local cemeteries, all Jewish dead in England were required to be transported to the Jews' Garden in London for interment. While some provincial towns like York and Oxford eventually established their own Jewburies, there is no surviving archival or osteological evidence of a dedicated Jewish cemetery within the medieval liberties of Leicester. This suggests that even after the 1177 decree, the Leicester community may have continued to utilize the established regional hub of Northampton or the capital for their burials. The absence of a local cemetery contributed to the rapid erasure of the community's physical presence, as there were no inscribed Hebrew headstones to remain in the Leicestershire soil as permanent markers of their lineage. The loss of cultural memory was further accelerated by the systematic sanitization of the borough's administrative records following the 1231 decree. The pipe rolls and the tallage rolls of the mid-13th century show a transition where Hebrew patronymics, such as Benedict, Aaron, and Sarah, disappear from the town's rent charge ledgers, replaced by the names of the Earl's Knights and the Christian burgesses of the Guild Merchant. This archival replacement ensured that the legal memory of Jewish ownership was severed, as the Arca of Leicester was reorganized to reflect the new homogeneous Christian jurisdiction. Consequently, the ghost of the synagogue is not a physical ruin, but an archival and archaeological void. The cultural memory of the 1231 exiles was not preserved in stone or parchment, but was buried beneath layers of subsequent urban development, leaving only a misnamed Roman wall and a few scattered mentions in royal writs to testify to the century of Jewish life that had once flourished at the heart of the borough. By the start of the fiscal year 1232, the administrative reality of a clean city presented the royal exchequer in Westminster with a localized budgetary deficit originating directly from the vacancy of the Leicester jury. The tallage of 1232, a national levy imposed by Henry III to fund his diplomatic efforts in Poitou, encountered an unprecedented black hole in the Midlands. The royal officials responsible for collecting the Jewish portion of the tax reported a total return of nihil from the borough, as the subjects who had previously generated a significant percentage of the regional tax yield had been legally erased from the town's census. This fiscal vacuum prompted a series of formal inquiries known as inquisitiones, directed at the Sheriff of Leicestershire to determine the exact status of the king's chattels that had been displaced. The legal paradox of this immediate aftermath was that while the physical community had been removed, their financial obligations, the debitus judaeorum, remained legally active and had technically escheated to the crown. Consequently, royal bailiffs were dispatched to Leicester in the spring of 1232, not to restore the exiled community, but to execute distraint upon the Christian debtors who had erroneously believed the expulsion had effectively canceled their high-interest bonds. The conflict over the physical real estate, the stone-built solar houses, reached a legal impasse as the Crown and the Earl debated the doctrine of escheat for flight. The royal chancery argued that any property vacated by Jewish subjects reverted automatically to the royal domain, functioning as a forfeit to the king. Simon de Montfort contested this vigorously, asserting that as the holder of the season and the grantor of the borough's liberties, the right to reassign vacant and waste land within the town walls belonged exclusively to his seigneurial court. This dispute necessitated a specialized audit of the pipe rolls, the continuous parchment records of the king's revenue, to trace the historical title of each stone dwelling and determine whether the earl owed the king a fine of entry to secure the legal right to grant these houses to his own knights. Furthermore, the 1232 aftermath revealed the structural difficulty of managing a split jurisdiction. While the exiles now resided in the London Jewry or the Northampton Arca, their legal identities remained tethered to their former Leicestershire holdings. The Royal Court of the Exchequer of the Jews spent much of 1232 adjudicating writs of right, where Christian tenants of Leicester attempted to provide evidence that they had already satisfied their debts before the 1231 proclamation. This created a period of intense litigation, where the borough's Portman Moot Court found itself frequently superseded by itinerant royal judges sent to recover the king's lost capital. The burgesses soon realized that the crown would not simply absorb the loss of its most taxed subjects. Instead, Henry III imposed a compensatory auxilium, or aid, on the Christian merchants of the Guild Merchant, to offset the vanished Jewish tallage. By the conclusion of the 1232 administrative cycle, the legal status of the Leicester expulsion was formally codified in the close rolls of the king. This documentation served as a final fiscal post-mortem, recording the total value of recovered debts and the permanent reassignment of the High Cross properties to de Montfort's administrative household. The aftermath proved that the removal of a population was a complex bureaucratic procedure requiring years of secondary legal adjustments to satisfy the fiscal appetite of the Plantagenet state. While the streets of the quarter remained empty of their original residents, they became the focus of a rigorous state-sponsored asset liquidation, ensuring that the wealth of the exiled community was thoroughly integrated into the royal and baronial treasuries before the 1231 decree was allowed to pass from active law into historical precedent. The mid-1230s in Leicester witnessed the crystallization of a new municipal identity, as the removal of the Jewish legal enclave allowed the borough to reorganize itself into a singular, cohesive corporate body. This transformation was characterized by the formalization of the communa, a collective of free burgesses who sought to exercise greater self-governance through the establishment of the mayoralty. While the earl remained the feudal superior, he increasingly delegated daily administrative duties to a chosen circle of municipal officers known as the jurats, or the Council of 24. These officials were drawn exclusively from the ranks of the guild merchant, ensuring that the town's judicial and commercial policies were perfectly aligned. The dual legal system that had previously separated the Jewish subjects from the Christian citizenry was replaced by a monolithic jurisdiction centered on the portmanteau, which now adjudicated all civil disputes and property transfers within the town walls under a unified set of bylaws. The economic environment of this transformed city was defined by the rigorous enforcement of guild exclusivity, which prohibited non-members from engaging in any retail trade or craft without the explicit license of the mayor. This protectionism was codified in the Borough Customs, a revised body of local law that prioritized the hereditary rights of existing families over any potential newcomers. Without the specialized credit facilities once provided by the Jewish community, the guild merchant established a system of mutual liability and communal loans that prioritized the solvency of guild members. This internalizing of the town's capital ensured that profits remained within the Christian merchant class, facilitating the rise of a powerful merchant oligarchy that would dominate Leicester's politics for the remainder of the century. This class consolidated its power by acquiring the vacant stone-built solar houses, converting them into administrative hubs or prestigious private residences that signaled their newfound social ascendancy. Furthermore, the absence of the Jewish population led to a standardization of the borough's fiscal obligations toward the crown. Instead of the unpredictable and individualistic Jewish tallages, the town began to pay the firma burgi, or farm of the borough, a fixed annual sum that granted the burgesses the right to collect their own tolls and taxes. This fiscal independence allowed the mayor and the council to manage the town's resources with greater long-term stability. Investing in permanent market infrastructure such as the High Cross and the riverfront wharves, the social fabric became increasingly homogeneous as the religious and professional distinctions that had once marked the High Cross disappeared, replaced by a singular identity, rooted in Christian guild membership and burgage tenure. This period also saw the development of the common seal, a physical symbol of the borough's corporate personality, which was used to validate all official acts and charters. By 1235, Leicester had moved from being a frontier town of mixed jurisdictions into a proto-modern city-state where the exclusion of the other had served as the primary catalyst for the creation of a disciplined, self-regulating, and economically unified urban society. The political legacy of the 1231 Leicester Decree manifested most acutely during the Second Barons' War of the 1260s, a conflict where Simon de Montfort utilized the cancellation of Jewish debt as a primary tactical weapon to maintain the loyalty of his military retinue. During this period, the Montfortian party moved beyond simple residency bans to the systematic physical destruction of the RCE, the chests containing the records of credit, in major urban centers such as London, Canterbury, and Lincoln. By incinerating these parchment bonds, de Montfort effectively performed a mass liquidation of the financial obligations owed by his supporters, the disinherited knights, thereby removing the king's ability to use those debts as political leverage. This strategy transformed the Jewish community from a fiscal asset of the crown into a vulnerable frontline target of baronial warfare, marking a definitive shift from administrative exclusion to active, state-tolerated violence. The massacres of 1264, conducted by de Montfort's forces, represented the violent conclusion of the ideological path that had begun with the non-violent 1231 Charter at the High Cross. Following the death of Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, the restored royal administration under Henry III and his son Edward did not return to the pragmatic tolerance of the early Beaumont era. Instead, the Crown adopted many of the Earl's exclusionary tactics to appease the remaining baronial opposition, leading to a series of restrictive statutes that targeted the community's remaining economic rights. The Statute of the Jury of 1253 had already mandated that Jewish subjects could only reside in towns with a royal arca, but the post-war legislation of 1269 and 1271 introduced even more severe prohibitions. These decrees formally barred Jewish subjects from holding free tenement or any permanent land tenure in England, a move that prevented the acquisition of property through foreclosed mortgages. This was a critical turning point that rendered the community legally incapable of participating in the traditional feudal land market, effectively forcing them into a state of total economic irrelevance. The shadow of the barons also influenced the 1266 Dictum of Kenilworth, a legal peace treaty intended to reconcile the warring factions of the nobility. While the treaty focused on the restoration of lands to the rebel knights, it institutionalized the baronial demand for relief from usury as a standard component of English political reform. This ensured that the anti-Jewish sentiment galvanized by de Montfort in Leicester became a permanent fixture of the parliamentary agenda rather than a localized grievance. The Crown's subsequent imposition of the tallage of 1274, which demanded the payment of 1/3 of all Jewish movable property, illustrated that the monarchy had transitioned into a liquidator role, seeking to extract the final remnants of wealth before the community's inevitable dissolution. The fiscal model had shifted from sustainable taxation to a terminal harvest of assets, mirroring the cleaning of Leicester on a national scale. By the early 1280s, the beginning of the end for Jewish life in England was characterized by a total collapse of the community's legal protections. The introduction of the Statute of Mortmain and the tightening of ecclesiastical badges of shame regulations ensured that the Jewish population was both economically and socially isolated from the developing English state. The 1231 Leicester expulsion had proven that a borough could survive and even flourish without a Jewish financial presence, providing the Crown with the empirical evidence needed to contemplate a total national banishment. The political legacy of de Montfort was thus the creation of a constitutional environment where the total exclusion of a religious minority was viewed as a legitimate and even necessary tool for good governance. This ideological shadow stretched across the final decades of the 13th century, ensuring that the Edict of 1290 would be received not as a radical departure from custom, but as the logical conclusion of a process that had been tested and proven at the High Cross of Leicester 60 years earlier. The 59-year interval between the local expulsion of 1231 and the general banishment of 1290 represented a period of genealogical contraction for the families originally displaced from the High Cross. In the primary administrative hubs of London, Northampton, and Oxford, these individuals were frequently recorded in the plea rolls of the Exchequer of the Jews with the locative surname de Leicestria, a clerkly designation that preserved their regional origin even as their physical ties to the Midlands were severed. Notable figures such as Benedict of Leicester and Aaron of Leicester appear in mid-13th century tallage assessments, suggesting that a segment of the former Leicester elite managed to integrate into the metropolitan financial hierarchies. However, their status in these larger communities was often secondary. They functioned as indwellers rather than property-holding burgesses, their wealth increasingly subjected to the Escheata laws, which allowed the Crown to seize the assets of Jewish subjects who died without direct, taxable heirs. The final decade of Jewish presence in England was characterized by a systemic criminalization that specifically targeted the remaining provincial lineages during the coin-clipping crisis of 1278, which led to the execution of nearly 300 Jewish individuals in London. Several families with Leicestershire roots were implicated in the judicial sweeps conducted by the King's justices. This state-sponsored purge decimated the leadership of the Anglo-Jewish community, leaving the survivors in a state of extreme poverty that rendered them fiscally irrelevant to the royal exchequer. By the time Edward I issued the final edict of expulsion in 1290, the descendants of the Leicester exiles were among the pauperes who required royal subsidies to pay for their passage across the English Channel. Their departure was a standardized bureaucratic exit. They were funneled through the Cinque ports of Kent, primarily Dover and Sandwich, where they boarded chartered vessels bound for the French coast and the Low Countries. The fate of these families upon reaching the continent was one of immediate fragmentation. Unlike the organized communal movement of 1231, the 1290 exit resulted in the dispersal of the Anglo-Jewish population into the territories of Flanders, Paris, and the Rhineland. The specific Leicester identity, which had been maintained through 60 years of internal displacement, vanished as these individuals were absorbed into the larger Sephardic and Ashkenazi populations of Europe. In the archives of the French monarchy, references to Jews of England appear briefly in the tax registers of Philip the Fair. But the specific lineages of the High Cross soon became indistinguishable from other Northern European refugees. This disappearance was mirrored in England by the Great Erasure of the late 13th century, where the royal clerks repurposed the parchment of Jewish debt books for utilitarian bindings and administrative scrap, effectively destroying the primary evidence of their existence. In Leicester itself, the final trace of the exiles was the transformation of their names into purely geographical or fictionalized legends. The Jewry Wall, as discussed previously, remained as a misidentified landmark, while the local borough records of the 14th century ceased to contain any memory of the 1231 charter. The properties once held by the community were rebuilt and subdivided so many times that the original medieval floor plans were lost beneath the expansion of the Tudor and Victorian city. The fog of history that consumed the Leicester exiles was a deliberate product of an administrative system that sought to create a seamless Christian narrative for the borough. By the time of the late Middle Ages, the Jewish presence in Leicester was treated not as a historical fact of a century-long residency, but as a momentary theological aberration that had been successfully corrected by the piety of the Earl. The twilight of the exiles was thus a total social and archival eclipse, leaving only the cold masonry of the Roman past to mark the space where a vibrant community had once stood. The River Soar remains the singular constant in the topographical history of Leicester, surviving the transition from the Roman civitas to the contemporary urban landscape. This hydrological feature provided the industrial power for the medieval mills that the 13th century exiles once financed. Yet the river's endurance stands in stark contrast to the intentional archival erasure that followed the 1290 general expulsion. For a period of 366 years, the borough of Leicester existed in a state of total legal and demographic exclusion, a phase known in Anglo-Jewish historiography as the Great Silence. This era was not merely an absence of people, but a systemic removal of the Jewish presence from the collective municipal memory, during which time the 1231 charter was relegated to the bottom of the town's common chest, protected from decay, but stripped of its immediate political relevance. The readmission of Jewish communities to England in 1656, following the diplomatic petitions of Manasseh ben Israel to Oliver Cromwell, did not immediately restore the specific heritage of the Leicester High Cross, as the new settlements were concentrated primarily in the maritime and mercantile centers of London and Bristol. The recovery of the history of the Leicester Jewry was largely the work of 19th century antiquarians and local historians, such as James Thompson, who began the systematic transcription of the borough records during the Victorian era. These scholars identified the 1231 decree not as an act of religious fervor, but as a foundational document of the town's municipal autonomy, reflecting a shift in historical perspective from theology to administrative law. The archaeological reality of modern Leicester is a palimpsest where the 13th century layer is compressed between the massive foundations of Roman public buildings and the sprawling infrastructure of the Industrial Revolution. Modern excavations have revealed that the medieval street levels, once trodden by the families of Aaron and Benedict of Leicester, sit approximately 2 to 3 meters below the current pavement of the High Street. The physical stones of the medieval quarter were largely repurposed into the foundations of later structures, such as the Blue Boar Inn, effectively burying the masonry of the Jewish solar houses within the subterranean architecture of the city. In 2001, the local authority and the Leicester Hebrew congregation collaborated to install a commemorative plaque near the site of the ancient High Cross, marking the first formal municipal acknowledgement of the 1231 expulsion in over 7 centuries. This act of modern public history signifies a move toward reintegrating the exiles into the borough's narrative, recognizing them not as aliens, but as integral contributors to the town's medieval prosperity. The memory of the community is also preserved in the rare Hebraic fragments discovered in regional archives, which highlight the scholarly exchange that occurred before the ideological hardening of the 1230s. Today, the silence of the archives is gradually being filled by interdisciplinary research that combines medieval Latin paleography with modern ground-penetrating radar. The Soar flows on past the remains of the North Gate and the shadow of the Jury Wall, serving as a silent witness to a community that was legally erased, but whose structural impact on the borough's development remains embedded in the very geology of the city. This concludes the historical survey of the medieval Jewish community of Leicester, a narrative of residency, contribution, and ultimate exclusion.